the clerk to once again, please call the roll.
Whitburn,
Here.
Elo Rivera,
Present.
Vargas is absent, Hall.
Here.
Moreno,
Is present and monitoring.
Bush is absent, and Goebel.
Here.
Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Member Moreno has entered the room. Clerk, do we have any public comment, non-agenda public comment? Anybody who would like to comment on an item that is not on the agenda will have up to 2 minutes, clerk.
We do not.
All right, thank you, clerk. We will now take up the approval of the minutes for the June 8th, 2023 Executive Committee meeting. Is there any public comment on the approval of the minutes?
We do not, Chair.
All right, is there any board discussion or a motion?
I'll make the motion.
All right, we have a motion from Member Hall
Second.
and a second from Vice Chair Goebel. Seeing no further board discussion, all those in favor of approving those minutes, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries unanimously. We will now move on to our discussion items, beginning with the MTS Access Services Overview. Please, once you get settled in, go ahead and proceed with this morning's presentation.
Good morning, Chair, members of the committee. I'm Mike Wygant, Chief Operating Officer here at San Diego MTS over Transit Services, and I'm joined by Jay Washburn, our Manager of Paratransit and Minibus. And to enhance the presentation, I noticed we wore the same suit shirts. Hopefully it works out well. So again, good morning. So as all of you know, we provide fixed route service within our region, and as part of that, and I'm going to go through a presentation that really defines another requirement as a grant recipient with the FTA and with ADA as it relates to fixed route. So and our access service is a little complex, and if you're not in it on a day-to-day basis, it can be kind of confusing, even for staff sometimes. So we like to take some time to show you how it works. So as I mentioned, it is a requirement under 49 CFR Part 37 with the federal government. If you are a recipient of funds for a fixed route system, you shall provide a paratransit or other similar service for individuals with disability at a comparable level. And that's an important word I wanted to really highlight. But a comparable or comparable, they use that in the regs in certain places. To the level of service that you provide for the individuals without disabilities for your fixed route system. It's also covered under the ADA as a safety net, but really what they're looking for is for persons whose disabilities prevent them from using your fixed route system. And it could be for a few different reasons. It's not specifically to their disability, but their functional ability. So MTS's service area is over 3,200 square miles in our region. If you were to see that on a map, and you've probably seen it, it encompasses a lot of area that some are developed and some are not. Some of that area has fixed route and some of it does not. And so the paratransit service has to be applied, and we'll go through a little more depth, but to those areas that you have fixed route. So areas like the development, a lot of people are familiar in our region. There's a lot of undeveloped area around Miramar Station, Naval Air Station, or Marine Corps. Dating myself, been in San Diego a long time. It's now Marine Corps Station, but we don't have fixed route there. So of course we would not have paratransit. So there's no legal requirement to provide service where you don't have fixed route. The access is again based on your functional ability, and that functional ability would prohibit you from riding fixed route. So it could be, you have no cognitive, you have a cognitive issue that would prevent you, or a physical issue providing it. And later we'll go into some more in depth about it may even be at certain times of the day or in certain locations. It can be used for anything. Once you're certified, The trip, there's no requirement for the trip to be for anything specific. Once you're certified, there's no requirement for you to tell us what the trip is for. That also prohibits us from prioritizing trips for things like maybe they're medically necessary for like dialysis compared to going to the movies. We can't prioritize that. Once you're certified, you can use it to go anywhere within the limitations. Congress had recognized that fixed route systems, although fully accessible, meaning they have wheelchair and all of ours now have ramps. Most of our rail equipment has low floor or, direct boarding. There are some few outliers that would have a lift. But even though that our vehicles are fully accessible and our facilities are fully accessibility, sometimes those cognitive or physical disabilities would still prohibit you from riding fixed route. Thus, we need paratransit. Within the DOT and ADA, it further defines the criteria on how you operate that. Some of the performance standards are really spelled out, the factors, and I'll go through some of that here. So it really comes down to what is comparable or comparable. And what that means is you have to provide it the same days and the same hours that you provide fixed route. So if we have a route that extends till 10 p.m. in a certain portion of our region, a fixed route, we would provide paratransit till 10 p.m. If we didn't provide service to that route on a Sunday, that area would also not be eligible for paratransit. So again, it has to be comparable. There's a theme here within the regulation. It's a shared ride program a lot of times. Just like fixed route, you don't get your own limousine taking you somewhere. So for efficiency, we talked about some of those operating standards that they require. They require efficiency in what we call PPH or passenger per hour limitations. They want to make sure that you're as efficient as possible while you're meeting the requirements. So part of that would be a shared ride program. Not all trips end up in a shared ride, but a large portion of them do. All rides that are requested, basically you have to provide it some notice. So what the regulation is the day before, 5 p.m. when we close our normal closing hours, you have to request a trip no later than 5 p.m. the day before of your trip. And you have to honor it within a 2-hour window. We call it the negotiation process. So if you wanted to be picked up at 4 p.m., just like fixed route, it's not that easy. You can't just say, well, I'm going to have a bus. I need a bus to come get me at 4 p.m. So similar with paratransit, if you need a trip at 4 p.m., the reservationists work with you. Sometimes we can get you a trip at 4 p.m. Like, absolutely, we'll agree to that. But sometimes, from efficiency reasons or just because of capacity, we have a negotiation capacity there where we'll say, well, we can come as early as 3. Does that work for you? And we can't go in, we can't request or force them to go any earlier than that. And we can also negotiate up to 5, an hour later. So there's a 2-hour window we have to provide the trip in. Once we agree to that time, let's say we agree to 4 p.m., then we're graded on the fact that it's on time, and on time means within that 30-minute window. So if at 4 o'clock we agree to, you'll not be forced to get on at 3:55. We will be there at 4, no later than 4:30. The rides, again, will be comparable or comparable to fixed route. And that's something that every single trip is evaluated in our database to make sure that the trip is not too long. Because again, they're shared rides. So you may pick up one customer here and they may want to go here. And obviously the quickest route would be a direct line. That's not how fixed route works. That's not how you're supposed to operate para. Again, you try to be as efficient. So the system is always evaluating other customers in the region that may need to be going in a similar area. And so where possible, it will pick others and then drop them off. But we want to make sure that they're not what we call OBT, or onboard time does not exceed the fixed route time. And part of that analysis would be if you were riding fixed route, you may have to walk a block to a fixed route bus stop. And then you may have just one bus to ride. And then you may have, when you get off at the terminus, maybe it's Old Town, you may walk a block to a center that you wanted to visit. That walking time and that travel time is evaluated. If you had to make a connection on a fixed route, that also is added to that. So that's the maximum. Obviously, we're not always that's not our goal. Our goal is to get them where they need to safely as fast as we can. But we always evaluate every trip against that OBT to make sure we're not exceeding that. And we'll talk about that, some of the stats related to that a little later. 10-day prior reservation. So this is something new that we do, and we'll talk about a little bit later. We allow, the regulation requires 2 days, meaning that 2 days prior is the earliest that they can make a reservation. Here at MTS, we have recently extended that to 10 days. It's an added feature to give them a little more time and advancement to book their trips. It still doesn't mean it's necessary. Again, I can't prioritize trips, but it gets them in the system, gets them a little bit of an assurance, gives us a little bit of information in advance on what 4 days is going to look like from now, not just 2 days. So it kind of helps both sides. This service is demand response. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. We do have lots of data to see what those trends are. And again, they can book the time. I kind of gave some examples on what we call a pickup time reservation, meaning they approach us and say, I want to be picked up at 4. That's a pickup time reservation. Then there's an appointment time, like, well, I don't really care when I want to be picked up because I know it's not a direct ride necessarily. I have to be somewhere by 5 p.m. So then we put trips in the system that way. And sometimes then we will come back and say, okay, if you want to be there at 5 p.m., we're going to be there at 3:45. Because they don't know, they don't know the travel times. We don't have the access to the data. So they can book the trip either way. Some other factors within the requirements of the law and how we operate it, it is curb to curb. Unlike fixed route, we'll actually go to their doorfront, the nearest place we can get the vehicle relative to their address that they request. Sometimes we'll get requests for trips that are on incredibly steep inclines that we can't safely get a wheelchair down, or we can't get the vehicle in a tight driveway with trees. So again, we have to actually, the first time someone will book a trip at a new location, we actually send management out there, or road soups, to look at it and assess it and give it an approval. There's a lot built into every new client and every reservation or every new location. They can also get door-to-door service. They can request that. It has nothing to do with once they're certified, they can choose that, meaning we'll actually park the vehicle at that location I just defined. We'll walk to the door. We will help them navigate the steps, the ramps, the path to the vehicle. We'll carry their bags. Of course, we help them get them on the vehicle and secure them if they're in a mobility device. Riders can be identified as do not leave alone upon their request. So a lot of cases, people with cognitive disabilities, dementia, Alzheimer's, they want to make sure that we're not just taking them to that curb and dropping them off. And also when we pick them up, sometimes we pick them up at centers. There's a requirement for those center staff to actually hand us off to our employees, and on the drop off, the same would be. And so it's in the scheduling system that they would be do not leave alone. And it sometimes has a process of who to call in the event that there's no one there. It doesn't happen very often, but occasionally we'll get a do not leave alone where no one shows up. We then, after we've called all the emergency numbers, sometimes we have to take them back to the place that we picked them up. We have to find somebody who's approved to hand them off to. They can get what we call a PCA, or personal care assistant, and they can travel for free. So sometimes people with disabilities feel more comfortable with someone who can accompany them. They can also have companions. They do pay the regular fare if they bring a companion, but PCAs are free. Speaking of fare, the current fare is $5. It's no more than double the fixed route cost of the trip. A lot of our clients get their trips, through books from their centers and whatnot, and so they don't pay for it. They get it, the centers purchase them, but we cannot increase the fare more than double our fixed route cost by the regulations and requirements. I went through a lot of things to kind of explain how access is completely different than fixed route, and so it does come at a premium cost. That's probably why some of the regulations are in place to kind of dictate how you operate it, but it really comes down to, as you can see here, roughly on average of $58 per trip per customer compared to fixed route at around $5. A little over $5, sorry. So how do you get the service? How do you get certified? So the certification process, again, isn't it's not defined by your disability, it's defined by your functional capability and your ability, your functional limitations as it relates to riding fixed route. And so that certification process is done through we have a contractor who's in our building across the street here at Imperial, MTM, and they're specially trained to go through this process. And it starts off, it's a two-part process. Again, it's functionally based. It's, because depending on your disability, you could have wide ranges of abilities. If you have Alzheimer's, it could be at different levels. But that assessment is done by MTM, and it's a two-part process. We have a physician validating or filling out an initial form, and then we have an in-person assessment. And that in-person assessment is done at our facility. We provide free rides to and from that location. Currently, the eligibility, if approved, is good for 3 years. And you have several different levels of certifications. Unconditional is the primary one, and a large portion of them get unconditional, meaning they can ride any day, anytime under the parameters I went through earlier, and it would be good for 3 years. Conditional, meaning, and we see that a lot with vision, or people who have, some limitations to their accessibilities, like when it comes to terrain. There's certain locations I just can't navigate that. Vision sometimes come into place as it's deteriorating through their disability. I can manage fixed route in the daytime, but I can't manage it in the dark. So that would be an example of conditional. Temporary, a lot of us in the room may make use of temporary. You may have an accident and an injury that prevents you from operating a vehicle or even using fixed route. So you may get a temporary certification. A visitor, anybody coming from out of town who's got a certification from any other agency is immediately allowed to ride our service. And then ineligible for the ones that are found to be capable through the regulation to ride fixed route. There's an appeal process through it. So how do we operate it? We operate it through First Transit. First Transit out of our Copley Park division operates not only our paratransit service, but a small amount of our fixed route, the minibus service, the smaller vehicles you see in the region. We own the facilities. Well, we actually lease half of the facility, but the parking lot side, but the vehicles and the mass majority of the facilities we own. It is a turnkey operation from them. Not only do they provide the operators, but the technicians, all the consumables, the reservationists, the scheduling system, all the dispatchers, HR, safety, all the things that come with operating it. They do provide, and this was been in place for many, many years, subcontractors, specifically taxi and a couple of wave providers. Those are vehicles with accessibilities. A lot of taxis don't have ramps per se, but they've always had subcontracts that are usually focused in on kind of the outlier trips, like a trip that where you can't conjoin a trip. No one else is going that direction. And it's all the way out in East County. Instead of burning 2 hours in a full-size vehicle with one person, if they're ambulatory and they're eligible for taxi, not everyone's eligible for taxi, we would then book that trip with a taxi. All the other rules still apply, the monitoring, every that. And so in most cases, those were used as more outliers to try to maintain the level of productivity. Every operator goes through a whole litany list of certifications. They're commercial drivers or operators. They have VTT requirements with CHP, and they have one specific one, the VDDP, which is Vehicles for Developmentally Disabled Persons Certificate. So they have one specialty certification on top of it. And as I mentioned a few times, not all the trips, everyone a lot of times assumes that most people are going to be in mobility devices, whether it be a wheelchair or walker, and that's not the case. It's actually quite a few people are ambulatory. So here is a picture of a few of the vehicles that we use to provide the service. Oversight. So it is our responsibility as the recipient to make sure that this is operated correctly. And so we have a pretty robust team of Jay and Carlos here in the background. This is their 100% job to be focused in on this contract and this service. They have daily performance monitoring. They're in communication. The dispatching group is with them all the time. We talked about MTMs actually in our building. We have monthly on-site inspections for vehicles and procedures and check-in process. We're always monitoring the performance numbers. not only for our contractual requirements, but for ADA, Department of Justice, DOT. There's a lot of agencies that have some skin in the game as it relates to not only transit, but specifically ADA and paratransit. I have monthly and quarterly safety reviews with their executive team, not only with Jay and his team, but our safety manager. We have quarterly audits of all of their vehicles and maintenance practices done by our in-house maintenance director and QA team to make sure that they're compliant with all of that. We're always looking for what we call barriers to access to make sure, as we mentioned, it's very expensive. We want to make sure that we're not only doing the right thing legally, but doing the right thing morally. We also have the ASAC, which member Gastel is the chair. So we meet quarterly to review with constituents from the outside, the contractors there, Jay's team's there. We have a lot of people providing input on what we can do better, what we've done right, what areas we need to focus in on. And our general counsel, the deputy general counsel, is also provides oversight for the service. ADA is a civil right. We want to make sure we don't do anything wrong or mess it up. I mean, all of our services are critical, and oversight and compliance is really important, but this is one area that gets even an extra look. So this is ridership. So the orange, probably not a surprise to anybody, that's COVID. We were operating about 40,000 people a month on access service. It took a huge drop, much more than our fixed route. On average, it basically lost 80% of the service. And what you see here the green is this year. And those are the 2 years prior to that, is that ridership did not bounce right back for a few reasons. A lot of the ridership goes to centers, community locations that help people like this, provide them jobs, work, or the services that they need. When the county was under emergency orders, almost all of them were closed. So what you're seeing is the ridership coming back a little bit because of that. And also because this really is, the most at-risk portion of our community. And so they typically, with the COVID impacts, are a little more inclined to find other paths or maybe not take some of the trips they would have. And so it is coming back, but it is by far the slowest returning ridership in our system. Again, it's demand based. I just kind of covered some of these. Before COVID, we were pulling in about 40,000 people a month. We have seen, although we are still sitting at roughly 55% of pre-COVID levels, 80% increases in the first year after we'll call the hit of COVID, which still does not get us to where, pre-COVID levels. But I say this because it's a moving target. It's demand response. We've had 2.5, almost 3 years now of reduced levels, and we're just trying to bridge that gap. 26%, I mentioned a little bit earlier that 26% of the riders are in wheelchairs, 18% are in the do not leave alone category, and 8% are door to door. Again, we cannot deny a trip when they try to make that reservation. We can work within that 2-hour window, but if they're certified, we have to provide the service. We have to find capacity within our own rank, or we use the subcontractors to try to fill that gap. So speaking of the gap, bridging that gap with the ridership decline, initially you're thinking, well, how did you manage that? Well, we still had all the vehicles, we still had all the facilities, we still had the reservation center. A lot of our fixed costs were still up there, and the bid model when with First Transit operating this was defined based on ridership of 40,000 a month, or $500,000 a year. Your fixed costs kind of took that into consideration. Well, because of COVID, there were days we lost 95% of our ridership. That's how they get paid. And so we had to step in and try to implement a few things to try to bridge that gap. We also made things even more difficult to be efficient. For social distance reasoning, we implemented single ride trips for everyone for quite some time. I think it was pushing a year. Just to provide that other safety net for people to be comfortable as they needed to go to dialysis or wherever that center was. And so that made it very difficult and clearly was not in the bid model. So we implemented a few things to try to help that. We reduced taxi service to almost nil to try to keep the frontline employees working. But you have 2.5 years of no ridership. We lost a lot of people, through attrition. We tried to furlough them. We kept them busy where we could, but in the end, we lost a lot. It's returning, as I mentioned. Again, we're at 55% of pre-COVID levels. Last year, we had an 80% increase compared to 21. And then this year we're on a 41% increase compared to last year. So it's coming back. We're up at 22,000 passengers per month. But it's a moving target, which makes it difficult. Every day I know how much fixed route service I'm going to have to provide, how many operators I need, when they're going to leave. I don't get any of that until at a minimum 5 p.m. the day before. So it's a moving target. So how do we manage that as COVID ridership is returning? Of course, we've brought every furloughed person that we can contact back for them to return to work. As we saw with fixed route, this is a tough market post-COVID to hire operators. The board approved back in December a $2 increase. That's helped. We've strengthened with not only First Transit and TransDev, but our in-house additional community events, hiring outreaches, referral bonuses. We did have to start re-implementing taxi trips. If we ran into shortages with operators, we would always keep our frontline ones working first. They were the priority. But we had to actually go out with First Transit and get even additional subcontractors to try to help. So some of the performance levels, just to give you kind of a snapshot of what the impact was to the service. Pre-COVID, we were performing very well, superior to our fixed route. And again, that's what we're graded against per the regulations. So OTP is on time performance. On board time, I talked about at length, was always more at 90 or more than 90% comparable to fixed route. Hold times and reservations, when I'm sure all of you use a phone to make a reservation or call a customer service center, that's another KPI. There's a whole laundry list, but these are really the big ones. Hold times were more than acceptable at 33 seconds on average. Missed trips. Now this is on a monthly basis. This does not actually mean I didn't provide you the trip. That just means I was outside of that 30-minute window. Remember, the regulation says you have to provide that trip within that 30-minute negotiated window. We are graded on a missed trip if the trip was still provided, but outside the window. Post-COVID. Now, when COVID first hit, the numbers were great. We had a lot of surplus operators and vehicles and no ridership. So the numbers were for months, 100% onboard times, 100% on-time performance, no missed trips. We were literally waiting for phone calls. So I didn't put those numbers because they were just all off the charts. As ridership started to come back recently, probably last summer, really got into a point where staffing was an issue. And this is the worst case scenario where you can see the impacts of trying to catch that wave, get ahead of that curve, that moving target, where our onboard times, we're still hovering around 90%, but really the OTP and the reservation numbers were way out of whack, way below our standard, our contractual standards, 88. Right? Yeah. And so not where we wanted to be. That's the worst case scenario. There's nothing good about a strike, but what I put on here is where we are post-strike. And really what hinges that is because the amount of subcontractors that we brought on to help during the strike. I'll go through that a little bit on the next slide, but we still have them. And so as we're ramping back up, operators have come back, we're hiring, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The numbers right now are looking really good. We had, a little bit lower than this number today, but on average, post-strike, the numbers are looking good, but a lot of that's because we have the subcontractors in our back pocket. They get the last amount of work, but it's helping us get through this curve. So the strike or the work stoppage, as we know, is a dispute between First Transit and the Teamsters. We initially experienced a work stoppage in April, the sympathy strike because of El Centro, and that had a 2-day impact. And then unfortunately, they were out for 37 days as we worked through this. We really had to rely on those subcontractors. There were a small amount of people who crossed the line, but the mass majority of the trips were covered by the subcontractors. Basically, and what it came to on average is we were providing 60% of the service that was requested 5 p.m. the night before. Now, when they would read the news or all of the communication and notification that we were providing, some of them would cancel their trips. Okay, but we were grading ourselves against what we had on the books. There were trips that we could not provide a lot, and we had to call them and give them notice and say, unfortunately, I'm sorry, we just don't have the staffing during this work stoppage. So it really was about trying to communicate that. I'm here to report I was wrong about this. I thought we would really, when the strike was over, we would have lost a lot of people through that. Typically, I've seen that. And we didn't. Right now, we've only basically lost 2% of the workforce that we had pre-strike. So that's good news. Just some pictures of the first day back. We had breakfast and lunch and all sorts of things out there to try to welcome them back and show support for them. The picture on the bottom right is the class the first day. There were 20 people in class. That was more than we had before the strike. So some good indications. You know, nothing ever good comes out of a strike, but some good indications post-strike. You know, the next steps, again, you know, ridership's going to continue to come back, and we are already back to post-strike numbers. So the impact for the strike has been absorbed at this point. It's really about the operators, trying to get more and more operators. You know, we were really ultra focused on that even before the strike happened, try to get ahead of that curve. We will continue to use the subcontractors to bridge that gap. We want to get back to that point where we're using subcontractors really for those outliers, providing the best service that we can. Pre-strike turnover and retention and even the class sizes were improving. You know, not where, again, we got some ground to gain when it comes to our own staffing. You know, with TransDev and First Transit being absorbed, there's been a bit of a change in the management approach. We've been very transparent with them to say, hey, this is a real issue we need to focus in on. Looking at those performance numbers, you know, that we had post-COVID, that's a real area of concern for us. You know, they brought in more HR staff. As I mentioned, the $2 increase was a big boost back in December. And then with this new collective bargaining agreement, we expect to see some additional improvement with attracting and retention of staff. We talked a lot about what the law requires. This is a laundry list of things that it does not require, but we do over and above for a couple of different reasons. We have an automated phone system that will continue to call them to remind them of a trip when the trip is there. If we're going to be late, we have a reservation portal where they can go in and kind of navigate their own trips if they choose. They can call us, of course. A mobile application for smartphones. We're working on a cashless fare system similar to Pronto. There's not a huge demand in this service for it, but we're working on it and want to provide that feature. Travel training. Travel training is not uncommon in transit. Most people usually get grants to focus in on it to try to promote people to not ride Parrot and get into fixed route. We do some of that with our MTM contractor, but we also do travel training to help them navigate the access service as part of that program. With the app, we have an automated, you know, ride track system. So like with the Uber Lyft, you can see where your vehicle is. And so you don't have to stand out of the curb or have your assistant helping you looking to see if that big, you know, white and red vehicle is coming around the corner. To try to use, you know, to loosen the load a little bit on the reservation center, we try to promote using the app or the website. So for the first time that you do that, you'll get 4 free rides. As I mentioned before, we extended the reservation window last month. So that's pretty new and innovative in the industry. Typically, people hold it to the 2 days. Another thing that Jay and his team are looking into and we're hoping to implement by October as a pilot is extending the certifications. The industry standard is 3 years. You see that almost exclusively across the industry. We want to move it to 5 years, kind of looking at the analysis. We don't have too many that are changing, but you know, you just want to make sure that you're really providing the right service as it relates to their functional capabilities. So we're looking to extend that to a 5-year certification. limits the amount of certifications we may need to do, also limits the burden on the customer. So that's it. That's a deep dive. We're here to answer any questions and hopefully that helped.
Yeah, and I want to thank Board Member Moreno for asking staff to bring this forward to this committee. This is an extremely important function of MTS. Sometimes it flies under the radar. You don't see our buses that often as much as the fixed route buses, but this is Disability Pride Month. The 33rd anniversary of the ADA passage is July 26th, and it's very timely for us to be talking about this. I do want to mention that we've requested an active peer review. We do this in different functionalities of our agency to have our peers from other agencies come in, look at our services, what we're offering, kind of our guidelines, just to make sure that we're giving the best 100% we possibly can in this area. So this is one of those that we're going to be doing in the fall, winter months.
Thank you. Clerk, do we have any public comment?
We do not, Chair.
All right. Do we have any board discussion? It looks like we do. We will start with Member Moreno then.
Thank you. And thank you for presenting. I think this informational item is very insightful. I think in my 5 years as an MTS board member, this is the first time we really take, or that I noticed, we take a deep dive into this very important program. I'm curious, I have a lot of questions. And just for background, is this item going to go to the board?
We have a really full agenda in July. We could potentially move a couple of the other report items, but we have a big queue because of a lot of the other actions we had to take the last 2 months. So.
And there's no rush, but I would make the informal request to the chair that this item does come back to the board at a certain time before 2023 ends, and that we seek information from our stakeholders. This is one of the most important programs I think that we have here at MTS. And just by way of background, my brother was diagnosed with depression when he was a supervisor at Qualcomm, had gone out to India numerous times. He was wrongly diagnosed. He actually had a tumor in his brain the size of a baseball, which was removed, and he's doing well, but they had to cut his ocular nerve. He's 43 years old. And 2 years ago, he wanted access to independence, right? He wanted some access to, not access, he wanted his independence back. So he sought transportation. He's getting his master's degree at SDSU now. So he's doing really good. And I did not want to give him a handout being a board member, right? I didn't want to say, let me just, call Sharon and get you. I wanted to really see how the average person the process that they go through to get in this system. I was very concerned. I was extremely concerned by the amount of time it took him and just how difficult it was, how many hurdles he had to go through. He actually has a whole, the whole timeline of how long it took him. He's a person that is a very, positive person, and he has a good disposition in life. But if a person might not have a good disposition in life, I could see them becoming recluse and not wanting to go through the hurdles. So that's what was concerning to me, is that to me, this program is not about checking a box and just moving forward. It's about really leaning into the program and actually having it benefit folks, as you stated, that were some of the most folks in need. I do have a few questions, and thank you for allowing me to share why I got here. MTM, this is a third-party contractor?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and how much is their contract each year?
I think it's about $500,000 a year.
$500,000 a year. Okay. And so they do all the qualifications. If somebody calls MTS, we send them over there.
Yeah, during COVID, we did a few different things, with what we called the VIT program, where we sent out new applicants. We would send out, our management staff would go out there with laptops or tablets, sorry,
To go out and.
Right,
train
go
them.
out to
Okay.
try to help them access, through the process so they didn't have to come in. But yeah, MTM
Okay.
does it all in person, that second part of the certification here at our facility.
Okay. Do we market this program at all?
It's on our website. It's, I don't know how else I would say that we would market it.
Okay.
It's on,
Well, I think we rely a lot on the partners who, like the centers, the regional center, the work. uh, There's places where a lot of people with disabilities go to work. We try to get those partners to assist with us.
yeah, I'm sorry, Jay reminded me, we do actually go out to centers
Okay.
and promote the service and explain to them how it works and the requirements to get certified.
Wonderful. Thank you. And then I was just curious, you mentioned, on slide 12, I'm sorry. And I just want to understand you correctly. Because of COVID, we furloughed folks. Did we furlough them? And I'm just curious. Did we furlough them after CARES Act funding came in or before?
So on the paratransit side, there's no guaranteed work because it's demand response. Obviously, we try to give as much people full-time work as possible. I'm not sure on the timing of the CARES Act funding, but
And
as
that's
there
the
was-
part that I was unclear of. So if I'm a paratransit driver and nobody calls in, I don't have work for tomorrow and I don't get scheduled.
right, as we're brokeraging the trips,
Gotcha.
within our rank and file, with trapeze system, we're trying to fill as much work as possible with the staff that we have. During
Okay.
COVID, it was the adverse. And so, yeah, in the end, when we lost 95% of the work, we just didn't have work for people.
What
Now-
was what was the negotiation in the strike? Between Transdev and the union, with regard to guarantee?
So if you know the answer, as far as what they negotiated for guaranteed work,
Yes.
Yeah, prior to the current contract, there was a guarantee of a 4-hour minimum if someone reported for work and there wasn't work. That normally would occur on very rare occasions because again, we use the subs basically for overflow, scheduling the first transit staff first. They're our direct contractor, they're our first priority. With the new contract, it's a 4-hour minimum for extra board drivers, which don't have necessarily a set start time. They're given that the night before based on call-offs. And then other drivers with a set scheduled time for start, it's a guaranteed 6-hour minimum for them.
That's tough. Thank you for answering that. But as a driver, I could see why we're losing a lot of folks, right? And a lot of it is just how this business is done, right? The two more things that I want to bring up quickly. We did have a public speaker a few months ago mention that her mother that had Alzheimer's was left alone. I think this happened to her or was dropped off and left alone. I believe it happened to her twice now. So we definitely have to focus a little bit on that, right? And also, it's been brought to my attention when a facility doesn't have a location, like a physical address, it makes it very difficult. For instance, SDSU, I believe SDSU, I didn't go to that school, but I believe it has like 1 or 2 addresses. I might be wrong on this, but it's difficult to drop off at universities because of the function of the whole address concept. And I wanted to bring this up to your attention. The other thing is, when was the last time this program was audited by MTS Audit Committee? Has it ever been?
well, internally, not ours, like Topeka and that audit committee, not in my time frame that we've been here. There's certain parts of that we audit as our process, quarterly, monthly, weekly. But as far as the internal audit program with MTS, I'm in my
Yeah,
time
it's
frame.
audited by the Federal Transit Administration. It was part of the triennial audit last year, but not internally. That's
Right.
why we want this peer review.
Yeah, I'm curious to see the peer review and I would also, I think audits are wonderful, although sometimes they're difficult to hear and see. I think this is probably one of the programs we should look at potentially auditing. But I thank you for the presentation. It was very insightful. Thank you for the work you do It is very important work throughout all of San Diego. There are obviously a lot of people we're missing, so my intention here is to get to those people as a board member to push us into the direction of having more folks come on board and have access to their independence. So thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak a little bit more than I usually do. And that concludes my comments.
Absolutely. Thank you, Member Moreno, and thank you for requesting the report. We'll go to Vice Chair Goebel and then Member Elo Rivera. Vice Chair Goebel.
Thank you, Chair. Can we go back to slide 10 since we're close? Slide 10. Just to be clear, when you say passengers, this isn't trips, this is unique passengers.
This is passengers, which includes any PCAs or companions. Usually that's about 5%, 3 to 5% on top of the actual trip count, because the federal reporting requirements are required to track all passengers, regardless if it's the direct request.
Okay, so this isn't 3 trips by 1 passenger. This is 1 passenger plus companions or things like that.
Correct. If a passenger goes from A to B and then B back to A, that counts as 2 trips.
2 trips, but 1 passenger.
Well, no, it would count as 2 passengers.
Oh,
Oh,
Well-
this is all of the total trips counted, both legs, like A and B, plus any companions they have with them on that.
okay. So in terms of customers, do we know if we're at 55% and we were up 80% last year, we're up 41% this year, do we know the mix of pre-COVID passengers who no longer use the service versus new passengers who have started since COVID? In other words, did we lose a chunk of old pre-COVID passengers and much of our growth is from new passengers? Do you see what I'm getting at, the mix? If I was a CEO of a company, I would say, I would go contact those who haven't taken a trip since pre-COVID and say, why haven't you come back? And that's kind of where I'm going with. And then I would do a survey of those who are new saying, how did you hear about us? Because that would help me go find more like them. Has any kind of this analysis been done?
I don't have that in front of me, but I know that analytically, we're not seeing any huge increase to justify the increase in riders over the last 3 years as new. In other words, the new certifications isn't jumping off the books as that's where all of our ridership is coming from. As far as reaching out to clients individually that we have not seen in 3 years, we have not done that, but we have reached out to the centers to try to communicate with them, which represents 50% of our service. Yeah. Right. Oh, well, yeah, as far as during the strike and COVID, we were communicating with them on a daily basis at times through the automated phone system. So they know that we're out there. They know that we're back in full operations, even the existing ones that we have not seen in 2.5, 3 years.
Okay, that sounds good. Oh, why 3-year certification? Is that a legal requirement? Is that just what everybody does? And where I'm going with this is there must be a cost to certification to do the process. But there's also, I wouldn't expect there would be a lot of fraud in this type of service with those who are taking these kind of trips but aren't certified because maybe they needed a temporary service as part of a recovery from an illness or rehabilitation, but they don't need it 3 years from now. Why 3 years?
So that is the regulation. That is what's in the
Okay.
charter now. And I think because again, when ADA was put into place and some of the regulations are there to assure efficiencies. Like you just said, we don't see a lot of fraud in it. We're not experiencing that. And that's why, we're proposing to extend it, but it is far and away the standard in the industry, I think, to try to assure efficiencies and assure there's not fraud. We're not seeing it in our region. There is some cost savings by minimizing the amount of certifications, but we really did it more as, we're piloting it as a program in October to do it more as an enhancement to the customer.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Goebel. Member Elo Rivera.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the report. Thank you, Councilmember Moreno, for requesting this item. With respect to our requirements, one of the things I was curious about is where we don't, our responsibilities aren't diluted at all when we contract these services, correct? In other words, the requirements from the federal government aren't diminished.
No, we are the grant recipient. We are ultimately responsible for all the adherence.
So when service is disrupted for any reason and it's contracted out, we're still on the hook.
Absolutely
Yeah.
responsible for providing the service, yes.
Got it. Okay. I raise that because I think the experience of the last couple of months has kind of driven home why it's so important to have a system in place where we are have complete confidence that we're able to maintain service levels. I've got one other kind of question about the service itself. How do we guarantee language access for folks who need these services?
All of our assessment personnel and the eligibilities are all bilingual. Our reservation center is all bilingual. Applications for eligibility program can all be run through Google Translate. So we'll provide applications in any language that someone requests them in. The Google Translate, however many hundreds of that is, that we can provide the documentation to them.
Okay, so what if a person doesn't speak English or Spanish, but they're calling for, they need to call for a reservation?
But both the reservation center and the eligibility center also have language assistance lines where they can get a third-party interpreter from a company on board line.
Got it. And one of the things I heard from the folks who work in the reservation center is that they've gotten away from hiring solely bilingual personnel, and that there have been monolingual folks hired who are in that reservation center. Do you have any knowledge of this?
It is not a contractual requirement that all the personnel be bilingual. It is preferred. There are a few individuals, again, coming out of COVID with staffing issues where the contractor did bring on a few English only speaking people. Again, better to have the phones getting answered. And then we had focus on the bilingual speakers. I know that there was an issue at the contract negotiations, and there was an agreement addressed on that regarding the bilingual speakers that was resolved as part of the new contract.
Yeah, I was glad to hear that. I thought it was treating monolingual and bilingual folks, treating their work the same. I would understand why that would feel unfair. You bringing an additional skill set to the workplace, utilizing that skill set, and not having that respected or honored in any way would be a recipe for feeling disrespected. I'm curious to what extent. So I saw that there's several subcontractors that are still being utilized. How does that work? I mean, I presume they're not in the same workplace as. Yeah, are these calls going out to a variety of different centers? What does this look like in practice?
Yeah, just high level. We get the reservations still through the internal reservation center. During COVID, we did have to, because some of them obviously were not coming to work. So we had to use a third party to help with that. But the reservations go through the brokerage process. We try to keep the direct employees working and provide as much service and work to them as possible, with the exception of when we talked about pre-COVID as far as the outliers. But now, we're still, even before the strike, we're short with operators. We were in a hiring frenzy, a class frenzy. And so we're still using those subcontractors to deal with those highs and low peaks. But the work is going to the internal employees first. We're trying to keep everybody working. As far as the subcontractors, they go through a vetting process with First Transit. The vehicles, like taxi vehicles, are inspected by our own internal compliance team and given certifications and approvals. All of their subcontractors that bring on those agreements are reviewed by us. They even get to go by legal to make sure that they're requiring all the same requirements and that there's an oversight by First Transit and then our own internal team at some level. And Jay
And
can
just,
explain.
all of the, subcontractors like the WAVE or wheelchair accessible vehicle operators are, we only use agencies that, are regulated and approved by the taxi administration at MTS. So that list came from there that was utilized to find vendors for that. And just, regarding your one question with reservations is all the reservations still come through the central reservation center at First Transit. Riders don't pick and choose or have to decide on a sub or who to call. We keep it a one number solution for all of the riders. They call, they book, and then First Transit handles the assignment out of those trips or what they do internally first, and then what's overflow right now based on staffing, what can go to subs. There's also restrictions on the subs. Some of the subs like taxi don't have the training level that an MTS employee has. We do not give them people with cognitive deficits. Those are done by MTS First Trans or Access or the wheelchair accessible vehicle subcontractors who again have had specialized training in it. So even within the program, we keep very strict limitations for the safety of the riders to ensure whatever mode that they're placed on is appropriate for both their physical and cognitive disabilities in these situations.
Got it. One of the reasons I asked about the subs is I'm trying to get a sense for how we're going to maintain morale. So that's kind of why I'm curious about, like, kind of in the workplace itself, to what extent folks are interacting with other individuals who may have crossed the picket line. That's again, when I think about morale and conditions for, contentious environment, conversations around who was or was not a scab, things like that.
The subs do not work off of that location. They all work out of their own independent third-party location. So there's no crossing of that staffing in any situation like that, other than individuals who, for MTS, who may have crossed the line during the strike and those that didn't. But it would strictly be within First Transit's MTS access personnel.
Thank you. And the last thing I was going to say is, I think I appreciate the presentation for sure. This is a really important service that MTS provides to folks who really, really need it. And I think it's an important part of our kind of social contract in terms of ensuring that folks, no matter what their needs are, have a way to get around and do the things that they need to do. So from that standpoint, I think it's just incredibly important that we create the work environment necessary to honor how special this work is. Some of the conversations with some of the drivers I found extremely powerful. They take a lot of pride in not just what they do, but who they are serving. And there's a couple comments that are just continuing to ring in my head about, being very proud of who they are taking where, and comparing that to folks who are delivering goods, and seeing that those folks who deliver goods are treated with more respect than they feel like their employer is treating them with, despite the very precious cargo that our drivers are taking. People, they said, they're delivering boxes, we're delivering people, and people with special needs, and we don't feel like we're respected for that. And so I think that just is even more reason for this to be a service that we have entirely in-house. A longer conversation, obviously, but thinking about, again, who it is that we're aiming to serve, how important that work is, and our ability to control not just maintaining that service, but ensuring that it is top notch, and that the folks who are providing that service are being treated with dignity and respect that they can feel. I think is incredibly important, and we'll continue to look. I will continue to look for ways for us to make sure we meet that mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Ela Rivera. All right, that was an informational item. Seeing no further board discussion. Thank you, Mr. Wygant. Thank you, Mr. Washburn. Really appreciate the very informational and thorough report on that. All right, move to item number 5, and that is MTS Park and Ride Parking Usage and Alternatives Market Study. And we will be hearing from Mr. Desmond and Mr. Marquez once they get settled in.
Good morning, Executive Committee. Dennis Desmond, Director of Planning. I'm joined on my left by Matt Marquez. Matt is our service planner and was the project lead on this study. And on the left is Fong Nguyen. He is our consultant with CR Associates, and he'll be giving more details about the presentation today. As everybody knows, we have a variety of transit stations and a lot of them offer park and ride lots. As we've been redeveloping these lots into transit-oriented development, there have been a lot of questions about how much of that park and ride parking needs to be replaced. Policy 18 does require that a developer do an analysis of the parking replacement requirement. But we've been looking and the board has requested a more holistic view of how much parking is actually necessary and what those trade-offs are between parking and more intensive development. So with that, we've brought on CR Associates last year to begin a study of that parking and helping us not only understand what the current conditions are, but also what the future demand is going to be so that we can more intelligently establish how much parking that we may or may not require with future developments. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Fong Nguyen, Senior Transportation Engineer at CR Associates, who's going to provide the rest of the presentation this morning. Maybe we'll trade. Yeah.
All right, good morning. So when we start this project, we move through, main goal is always to maintain or increase transit ridership as that's the primary missions, while facilitating transit-oriented development. But with any kind of development, there's always a trade-off. So we always have to keep our eye on equity and how what we do affect the rest of the system. And then finally, we'll provide parking management strategy that generate or at least supplement transit riderships, as well as provide MTS with a tool to estimate future parking demand, make an easier way for staff to go through, evaluate project as developer approach MTS, instead of just having to do an individual study each time. Other consideration that we took when we went through this study is that each stations, because of how wide the network is, especially including East County, each station have a unique pattern and demand. And whatever you do at one station does affect the other. One key item for everyone is just, how can you get to where you need to go on time? And does the potential development affect that or not? We have to mitigate unexpected outcome like overflow, and under existing conditions, some stations already experiencing overflow, and optimize the assessment process, just streamline the whole process with a tool just to make it easy. Generally, our process goes as follow. We start with the existing condition, collect existing condition data. Because of the pandemic conditions and ridership haven't fully recovered to 2019 conditions, I'll go through some of those details. Our future parking demand then is based on the 2021 regional RTP projections that with adjustment to account for actual on the ground ridership data, as well as historical and current parking count. We also do account for mode shift that would occur and any other changes in the transit network. Our best practice review consists of lesson learned from other agency, but more importantly, based on previous experience that MTS had with some of the strategies. So we ground truth to make sure that it worked for the local conditions and not just bring in the latest fancy items from outside. Our parking management strategies finally conclude with a set of items that can be selected for each project, because not every project is the same. Your footprint, pipeline, any other item could affect how a site could be developed and how parking could be managed. So it's not a one size fit all, but rather the appropriate tool for the jobs depending on the site. First is we start with our study area selections. We start with the 24 station within the study area, but then in terms of in the interest of maintaining a sufficient and clear budget, we reduced the data collection to 16 stations where we collect detail, and the rest was based on historical parking count that MTS conducted yearly. We supplement that with mobility data, big data, just origin, destination, travel pattern, as well as survey data to identify the capture area of where each of these transit stations serve and how we would collect the information, including observations of any existing spillover onto nearby street. For the existing conditions, we coordinate with MTS and then MTS security force to install high-resolution camera at the entrance and exit of every station that we collected. Was collected on November 15 from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And then we feed that through a cloud-based recognitions that capture the license plate information. That basically allows us to identify and figure out how long is a car in the parking lot, whether it's just a short trip that's a drop off, or if it's going to be a longer trip, like your daily commuter pattern or something later. The reason we stop at 6 p.m. is just because of lighting conditions. It's really hard to capture any license plate later into the evening, especially during the fall season. Then we calibrate that with historic parking count and then historic current transit ridership, the SANDAC onboard survey, as well as US Census data to develop the baseline conditions. And this is developed for each of the stations that we evaluate. Our finding then is summarized into an easy to read 2-page summary sheet for each of the stations. It covered the capture area, the mode share of how people are getting to that stations, whether or not they drive, bike, walk, or is a bus transfer. We also captured the parking durations that you can see on the left side of the screen, the orange, which divided out into by how many hours people park during the day. Some are short trips, some are long trips, but we did find a significant percent, approximately 10% are just from people getting there and then wait to pick up a passenger. And those we see them, we didn't include in anything that was a quick drop off. If something occurred within 5 minutes of each other, so that car enter within 5 minutes and then exit right away, we took that out because there was a significant number of that and we can manage that with better strategies. The average parking durations overall for the network is about 6 to 7 hours, which coincide more with the commute trip pattern, but there are other patterns that we need to account for. And I'll go over that in a bit. For the future parking demand, we use the year 2035 scenario, and based on the 2021 RTP, which was the latest at the time of when we start the study. I understand the amendment is out for review right now, and we'll cross-reference that as we get more available data from SANDAC. But basically, we calculate the existing mode share, the future mode share, as well as the parking demand for each of the stations, and then adjust it to account for any other shift, or if because the sensitivity of the SANDAC model may not reflect the actual availability of parking space. In an area where we found there's an overflow, and if it's within reasonable distance, then we shift that extra parking demand to the adjacent stations, because that's just naturally it's what people would do. If they find that one station is overpacked, they would try to park at the nearest stations. However, there are situations where it just exceeds the available capacity as well. Finally, all of those informations are aggregated into this tool that you see on the screen here. This is, we make it open source so that staff can go in and edit and change. We make it, there's two parts. First is you can select a station to tell you your future parking demand and whether or not some of those are already being shifted to an adjacent stations. The other thing is you have the option to also input in anticipated land use. And based on the Institute of Transportation Engineer parking rate, it generates the expected parking demand options for each of the stations. There's also a slider in here where if should MTS want to consider a share parking options, you just toggle that checkbox and then it overlay the transit parking demand with the residential parking demand, which typically have different time, but it does overlap during the early part of the day and the latter part of the day. Those demand does overlap with each other. So we just provide that as an options. And then finally, as station development, the parking inventory is going to be changed. So we build that tool in here as well for the ability to override the parking capacity of each site. As far as the future parking demand finding, overall, stations in the urban core are the most impacted, and that's where I see that under existing conditions. Some of these are overflow from nearby land use due to just, it's hard to do enforcement at every stations all day. Whereas stations on the outer edge definitely have a lot more parking availability. And then station in the urban core with the larger footprint or excess parking space, most of those are currently in process of constructions, permitting, or negotiations. So that leaves us with a handful of stations that have potential redevelopment, and we need to look at other strategies to not just offset the parking needs, but if we offset those, accommodate the people that need to make that last trip. They need to drive because of fear for safety, because of the distance, or because transit services may not be running late night when they get off of their job, any of those variations thereof. So then we start to look into parking management strategies. We pull over 30 documents, review the best practice, and some of the key items that we feel would be feasible and implementable for our regions made it into the final list. It's also based on input from MTS staff on previous experience, because some items are just, we tried, it didn't work too well for our regions. Maybe it may work at a later time, but those didn't make it into the list at this point. And then we include in finding and from the social equity listening tour as well, because that's a crucial item as we make change to these area. But most of all, the strategy have to result in a net positive cash flow for MTS, so that you can use that cash flow to improve the mobility, the station conditions, any other amenities that would be crucial to making a successful TOD. Most affordable housing when they come in is already on a razor thin margins. So we have to have a way, can't just say, well, developer, you pay for all these, so it's a joint partnership. So we look at a way to make it a net positive cash flow, at the same time, allow MTS the capability to right size the parking need for at each stations. Overall, our strategies goes into two categories. The best practice are more of first last mile treatment, what should be going on around each station, what you should consider as a site develop. Connectivity to the surrounding area is always key, as well as pedestrian scale lighting and accessibility. There are historical in other area. There are development where the building is on one side and you have this giant parking lot and no pedestrian pathway. So those are what we put into the best practice in terms of accessibility. And then we have parking management strategies, which more overlay the multiple strategies that and how it can work together. Unbundled parking would be one of the options, as well as you can charge for parking, but the pricing have to be optimum. So we provide detail and recommendation on how to implement it, how to monitor it, and what to do in the future should you need to make adjustment for that as well. And that's it. I'll be happy to go through any of the previous strategies in detail, or if you have any questions.
Thank you for the, oh, go ahead.
Thank you, Fong. I just wanted to mention that the report's in a final draft format. So we wanted to get input from the executive committee before we finalize that, and then the report will be available for everybody to view.
Very good. Thank you for the presentation. Clerk, do we have any public comment?
We do not, Chair.
All right. This is an informational item. Do we have any board discussion on this item? Member Ela Rivera.
Thanks for this presentation. I'm really really interested in this. Obviously, we asked a lot of questions about the utilization of our parking, understanding again the importance of park and ride as part of our system. I continue to be really intrigued about what sort of creative options we might have with underutilized space at our park and ride lots. For example, EV charging spaces, designated parking for shuttles, like Fred's, or as we continue to expand those sort of options throughout the region. I'm wondering if there's anything kind of not included here that's on the more creative side that wouldn't necessarily be a great idea today, but is something that's, you know, intriguing and something for us to keep on our radar?
Well, one thing we did not include is EV charging. And strategies like Fred or your local mobility shuttle, while those can be implemented, they typically cost significantly over time to operate them. Most of the ones that are currently being used right now are basically mostly grant funded. So unless you have an additional parking district to fund the operation of the shuttle, it's not feasible for MTS standalone. It would require partnership with the city of San Diego or
Right.
other agencies. As far as EV charging, it can be implemented. And it has been done in some places. However, then you have the issues of enforcement. How do you make sure that people are just using that for during the time when they need charging, and have a way to disincentivize somebody from using EV space as premium parking space in a lot of parking structure, especially the free one that we look at, including down in Chula Vista. EV space, because they're so upfront, essentially become de facto premium space, and people just park there without actually charging or using it.
So understood on the parking but there's an opportunity for partnership there theoretically.
Theoretically, yes, and that's also, that would be a good opportunity for net positive cash flow as a site develop, but other items have to be taken into considerations, and then, you know, this complex stuff such as whether you have enough power capacity in that end of the grid to even support how many stations.
Right. And then another question kind of on the solar side of things are any opportunities for larger solar projects that could help with our energy demands? I know that the city utilize certain financing where I'm not going to get it all right now, but especially with the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the money that seems to be out there for larger scale energy projects. Do we know of any transit systems that are out there that are building these in order to help with their energy needs?
Yeah, actually, you know, I think that policy 18 really prioritizes intensifying the development at the stations rather than using parking. So that's a great discussion to have with each potential developer. But there are also stations that are not suitable for redevelopment where it's probably going to remain surface parking. For example, Gillespie Field is in the airport flight path, and you can't put a residential development under that. Maya Drive has a large trunk sewer line underneath it. That's going to be difficult to redevelop. Some of those stations may be appropriate for something like that because you can't redevelop it. And that's certainly something we can take a look at going forward.
Yeah, I'd certainly be interested in that. And then the last question I have is in terms of hours of operation for parking, I just don't know this. Do we have rules in terms of overnight parking?
Generally, we have a 24-hour limit on parking. We don't prohibit we don't prohibit overnight parking because we do have people that work, I don't know, graveyard shift is still the word that we use, but we have people that work overnight and need to be able to be there overnight. We do a lot of parking for special events where people are out until, 1 or 2 in the morning before coming back. So we've always had a 24-hour parking rule.
Got it. Okay. Well, looking forward to seeing this conversation continue to evolve. Any creative options for how to better utilize these spaces, I think, is something that I'm open to. Obviously, housing is critical, but there's, I think, a lot of other options as well in terms of making them the highest and best use of all of MTS property. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Elo Rivera. We'll go to Member Moreno and then Vice Chair Goebel.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. This conversation, I think, for me, really started when we we brought forward the development of Palm Avenue, the project on Palm Avenue. I don't disagree that housing is a #1 priority. It is a very important priority, but if we put our MTS hat, it's about transportation and how we move people in the whole San Diego County. And obviously park and rides are a part of this. a part of the system, right? And I think that a good example of a park and ride being still very relevant and important is just the millions of dollars that we spent on UCSD, on the UCSD line, right? And how there are park and rides in the La Jolla area for the transportation system here in San Diego County. And so with Palm Avenue coming in, we really didn't have an idea of how utilized or underutilized Palm Avenue was, right? So I think this is a very relevant study and I appreciate you guys bringing it forward. You mentioned that there's 24 park and rides in our system. Did I get that correct?
There are no, it's the 24 park and ride that we identified was based on the potential of redevelopment.
Gotcha.
Because there are other locations where there's no potential for redevelopment. And so those kind of stay static as is because, you know, whatever we do in this area does not affect those as much.
I got you. So there's not, how many in total do we have?
I don't know.
I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
It's probably in the neighborhood of 30 to 35.
Oh, wow. Okay. I wasn't aware of that. And you said out of those 24, 18 were studied.
Those 24, 16.
16 were studied. Okay. And I'm sorry, I didn't get a chance to look at the actual study, but you have numbers on all those 16?
Yeah.
On the
So we mount
utilization?
the camera for basically 6 a.m. to 6 p.m.
Yes.
We did initial sweep and then we did a closing sweep as well. Just make sure that we captures any straggler stuff that the camera didn't pick up because they're starting to get dark. We have the daily and then hourly. Basically, we capture every minute, every car that enter or exit. We see it. We see some unique pattern as well. You know, unofficial school bus using park and ride for drop off. People go in there and rest for a few hours. You see a few interesting things.
Interesting. Well, and all of that information, all of that, is the raw data part of the study or you guys have the raw data?
We provide a summary of it. We do not publish the raw data because of data security.
Yeah.
We keep a copy of the video until the conclusion of the project, and then we delete the video. As far as the summarized data, including license plate information, we store them in a hard drive that is not connected to the internet. We don't want to publish people license plate information.
Oh, no, okay. I get that. Well, thank you for the presentation. And once again, I think the study is really relevant, especially as we look at the future of our housing or potential housing developments within the MTS system. And I believe that this will give us more information to take to developers, right? When we want to make sure that we're not pushing away customers that actively use transit because we're going to put housing in it, that we're still addressing their park and need rides, their park and ride needs, I'm sorry. So we are not losing customers, but we're actually gaining customers, right? I think that's the key thing. Did I catch that you're recommending that we charge for the parking?
One of the unique, it's been applied but not system-wide that we are proposing, and you see in the report, is considered charging for parking, but not in the sense of you just charge for everyone in and out. Rather, as a development occur, the developer would be responsible for the building footprint, the maintenance, landscape, and so on. But the actual number of parking space left over in that area would be MTS property. MTS can then lease a certain number of space back to the developer to use for their resident. And then you can also charge for the remaining space. There's two things. One is that as the transit system change, you have a way to adjust on how many transit space you need versus how many you don't need. And on the other hand, the number of space would allow developer to make it feasible and make their property financially feasible.
Okay. Well, thank you for the information and I look forward to this going to the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Moreno. Vice Chair Goble.
Thank you. Very thorough report. Excellent choice in contractors to study this. Your data security practices are good for the public. Your ideas for how you measure things are very good for the public. And it's very, very, very well done. Let's go back to slide 11. I have a question.
Sure.
I just want to make sure that part of Sandag's regional transportation plan going forward in the future assumes less vehicle miles traveled which puts people into perhaps more public transit. Am I correct in saying you addressed this and included that in your calculations or formulas?
Yes, that does include that, and we choose 2035 instead of the horizon year 2050 because the 2050 has such an aggressive network that we're unsure if it would be built out. And for the purpose of what we're doing now is we're looking at the very near-term development potential of these sites. So going to the full build-out and mode shift doesn't make as much change. Rather, 2035 have some transit improvement that Sandak assumed in the model, as well as a smaller percentage of the road user charge at that point in time. That's when we have the model.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Goebel. Seeing no further,
Chair Whitburn, can I just make a few
yes,
follow-up comments?
Ms. Landers.
I just wanted to, in response to some of the board members' questions, we've got some concurrent issues that we're dealing with, so I just want to make you all aware. So all of the TOD projects that are in the various phases of design are incorporating per various code, the ability to add electric charging at a certain number of the spaces. One thing that we as MTS will have to come up with a policy organizationally is how do we implement that? You know, having something that's uniform across those transit parking lots or where we have our exclusive transit parking. What are, you know, we'll have to find a vendor. How do we manage that charging program? And so that's kind of something on our to-do list. We have struggled with, you know, as you saw in this report, the average car stays for 6 to 7 hours. So is that really an efficient way to use an EV charging station? Somebody's going to come in and be in that one space all day long. I don't know what the best solution is, but those are some of the issues that we're going to have to work through and figure out how do we bring back a EV charging program for those spaces as they get added at each of these lots. So that's one issue that we're dealing with. We're also concurrently coming up with parking management strategies as we have the mid-coast stations that have been, you know, were built as part of this. You know, one of our unique ones is UTC Westfield Mall, and that parking garage was built inside the envelope of the Westfield property. And so right now we don't have a parking system that can talk to the Westfield parking system. So we've spent the last year trying to find a technical solution to that. And so while there is a parking garage at UTC, our patrons have to go through the Westfield gates, and they either, if they're there short enough time, they get the Westfield validation where it's free. If they're longer, they pay the Westfield price. And so we have been working on parking strategies of how do we integrate that. And one of the things that I think we're going to test out and try is a way to program the Westfield gates to know when an MTS customer with a Pronto card comes in, and that if they come in and then they tap their card to pay for their fare on 2 trips. So they tap on the platform at the trolley station, or when they get on a bus at the bus station, and they take their trip and then they tap to return. That would be sufficient to basically validate their parking and have them have free parking at that station. And so that's a way where we can make sure that those transit parking spaces are being used by actual transit riders. And so we were going to test to see how that works. And so we're in the final stages of trying to work something like that out with Westfield. But those are the strategies that, like, if they work at one, then we'll see, can they be implemented, you know, system-wide? And is that something that the board's interested in?
Very good. Thank you. We'll go to Vice Chair Goebel again, and then Member Hall, and then Member Elo.
One more question is the option of like an app-based, there are 6 parking spaces available at this station or something. There are places that you can find out how many are available before you go there. Was that part of an enhancement somewhere in this discussion?
We aim for practicality. It is not part of it. It's definitely one of the technology that can be done. However, it add on to the development cost of each site. So it depending on the developer, or if we can find additional funding to fund that kind of strategies. Additionally, then you would also have to select a parking vendor to operate that. It's just not recommended that you pick one that develop their own app, but rather one that's already internationally or nationally known, so that you have one common app that you use across the board.
Member Hall.
And getting back to your electric vehicle charging station, I think they run about 50,000 each. Anyway, that's what they keep telling me. And, but again, that's my problem is, as I have a semi-electric car. I never called it an actual electric car. But when I plug in, if it's sitting there for 6 hours, a lot of times you get fined. So we're gonna have to figure that out too. But on the other hand, I don't necessarily think that's something we're gonna have to work on. And I don't think I really have a problem. We keep doing it, but at $50,000 a pop, somebody needs to come in and pay for those other than us.
Member Ela Rivera.
Thanks. Yeah, appreciated that, Karen. I think just to kind of just lay out a little bit more in terms of where my head's at. I actually think this is a potential revenue opportunity for MTS on a couple of fronts. Those theoretically, those charging spots, we could charge for them and we could charge for the time you're parked there in addition to, or in lieu of just the charging itself. And then I know that we're doing this at the city, that some of our larger solar projects, we're able to finance that based on the savings that will accrue over time. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities here in terms of utilizing that space again to serve multiple uses. And one of them can actually be from a revenue or cost saving standpoint, or perhaps even both. But I don't think I'd be supportive of the idea of just, kind of free plugins for folks that can sit there and be used for, 6 or 8 hours at a time. Unless, it's one thing if they're paying for the time. But there's a lot of convenience in that, I think, as well, like going and working and coming back to a fully charged car. I actually think that there'd be a bit of a market for folks. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation and for taking our questions. Appreciate it. All right, that is an informational item, so we will move on in the agenda and we'll move to item number 6, which is a review of the draft July 27 MTS board agenda.
One item I wanted to let the executive committee know we're adding is an item on security staffing. This was a information item we're going to bring forward based on board direction at the last board meeting. So that's just one more item to add to the list.
All right. Item number 7, other staff communications and business. Anything else?
I'll just remind everybody that Comic-Con is coming up. So it's all hands on deck for us. We're also going to be participating in the Pride Parade on Saturday with our old bus, which I can't remember what year it came from, but Mike's back there. He won't remember. He wasn't even born yet when it came from.
Very good. We will look forward to the Pride Parade and of course the Comic-Con. And thanks in advance to all the staff who will be engaged in those endeavors. Any committee member communications or other business? Seeing none, our next meeting date is September 7th. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody.